Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this evening's event. It's a testimony to our speaker that we have so many guests during election time. I've had many meetings cancelled in Westminster over the last couple of weeks because of pressing events. Policy Exchange is very delighted to welcome Robert D Kaplan, who is one of the world's leading thinkers and writers about global affairs, for a discussion which we hope will be as wide-ranging as possible. We have a few topics we want to touch upon, and I very much want to bring in the audience at various points to discuss a series of pressing current, historical, potentially future global issues as well. You've all seen the blurb with invitation, so I don't want to read through Bob's long and very impressive CV for you, but I will mention a few highlights because they will bear upon tonight's discussion. In the first instance, I want to talk about Earning the Rockies, which is Bob's last published book on the state of American politics and how much that America does in the world radiates outwards from its own internal geopolitical situation. And then also, if I may, Bob's publisher, who's very efficient, sent me proofs of his forthcoming book as well, which contains a lot of essays on, among other things, Donald Trump. So perhaps if we can get the discussion to Trump and North Korea and China as well, that'll be helpful to the audience as well. So let me start, Bob, by asking about your last book and the fact that it obviously surged in popularity shortly. It was written before Trump's election, but surged in popularity thereafter. I wonder if you could explain, for those who haven't seen it or read it, the basic thesis.
Yes. What I did was 2 years ago, I always believe in reporting, that at the end of the day, you're a reporter, you're an observer. I spent 1.5 months driving slowly across the United States and overhearing conversations. This was in 2015, when all people knew about Donald Trump was that he was a wealthy real estate developer who was often in the tabloids in New York City and hadn't declared yet for the presidency. And what I found was this. It was that America is a continent before it is anything. Halford Mackinder, in 1904, wrote that it was the greatest, North America was the greatest of the geographical satellites around the mother continent of Eurasia and Afro-Eurasia, and thus was protected from the conflicts in Eurasia. But at the same time, the United States has more navigable inland waterways than the rest of the world combined. And this river system all flows into the greater Caribbean, which is into the great sea lines of communication, so that it was the combination of continental isolation mixed with a river system that had ports throughout the inner continent that tied it in through trade with the rest of the world. Like Pittsburgh in interior America was a great international port in the 19th century. So it was the combination of the two that formed the basis of American power, at least in geographical terms. It was protected from the old world, yet it had interests in it and was able to influence it at the same time. And remember, it was the Caribbean that gave America power. It was by dominating the greater Caribbean in the late 19th, turn of the 20th century, that America came to strategically dominate the Western Hemisphere. And once it could do that, it could affect the balance of power in the Eastern Hemisphere. And that is what the history of the 20th century with the two world wars and the Cold War were all about. But again, inside that continent, it was vast. America's first nation-building experience was not in the Philippines. It was in the American West itself, which was water-starved, less than 20 inches of rain per year, meaning that had America spread from west to east rather than from east to west, we might have developed into a much more authoritarian state than we did. Because there was so little water, it had to be apportioned by government, which led to big role of government. And when you drive across America today, you see the bigness, the vastness. Now, what I saw this time was, I wasn't thinking about Trump, but what was noticeable was between the two coasts and outside of the major university towns, And outside of a sprinkle of cities like Des Moines, Iowa, and elsewhere that were just booming and were become global cities on their own, was a vast interior continent where the middle class was disappearing before my eyes. A smaller section of that previous middle class had drifted upward into like a whiskey-sipping, Chardonnay drinking global upper middle class. And you saw that even in Nebraska and western Kansas and Wyoming, because the red-blue divide is actually much more complex than it seems. Missouri went for Trump, but St. Louis and Kansas City went for Hillary Clinton. So outside of those areas, you saw a vast middle where, as I said, the upper middle was drifting upwards into the cosmopolitan global elite, but a much larger percentage of the previous middle class was drifting downward into working class, lower mean, working class existence, just one or two personal tragedies away from outright poverty. And things look bad. People, you know, obesity is a cliche when people talk about America, but you see it everywhere. And so you saw you just saw a great portion of the interior continent that had not benefited from the policy elite of the past 25 or 30 years. And that's what I saw, and that's what I described. I didn't put it all together as to what it would portend, because Trump wasn't even a candidate by then.
As to where the state of America right now, and there's a flurry of books, kind of anxious, full of anxious Americana essentially at the moment. I read another of them the other day, which is by Tyler Cohen, and he argued that one of the problems that the United States faced is that it got rich on what he calls low-hanging fruit. So it got rich on the fact that much of the country had no infrastructure when most of the population arrived there, that they educated very quickly an intelligent, often put upon new immigrant grouping, and as soon as that immigrant grouping was educated, therefore that they became more productive. And America's sort of reached this position of stasis and stability and fear of change. And he says it's because of internal dynamics. But as I understand it from your thesis, you relate really America's problems more broadly to where it stands in the global economic position.
Yes. The book is very deterministic because that was the subject, geography. And geography in and of itself is deterministic. But America is a continent that, because of its geographical isolation, did not have its infrastructure devastated by World War II. Europe, China, Russia, all had their infrastructure decimated by World War II. So America had this big advantage that only in recent years has been dissipating.
And so do you think that while you didn't see the Trump election coming, and you could make a counter argument that actually you break down the electoral victory to establish Republican pockets of support, plus a few Rust Belt districts that voted twice for Obama but flipped over to Trump. But do you think he does represent a kind of an expression of angst or concern from a particular socioeconomic or regional portion of American society?
Yes, I think he does. First of all, it was the American middle class that essentially acquiesced to the American military imperial-like armature of the past 75 years. America dominates the globe through a 300-warship navy. Every aircraft carrier with its fighter jets is $18 billion. Every destroyer is $4 billion. And the American middle class could support this because it existed. And now the American middle class is disappearing. It's starting to disappear. And that raises a real question of American leadership. How you vote depends on where you stand. And whereas the global elite, and you could relate this to Britain and Brexit as well, in New York, California. Remember, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote because of New York and California. Take away those two states, Trump wins even the popular vote in a landslide. If you live in this vast interior continent, your wages haven't gone up. Every place I went, I saw cities of 20,000, 30,000. The main streets were deserted. The stores were boarded up. You know, it was, you know, just utter economic devastation. And in many of these places, as I said, wages have not gone up, you know, visual devastation. And they, rather than see the upside of immigration, like you see in the big cities and in the college towns, they saw the downside of it. You know, they saw the poorest element of immigration from Mexico rather than the most wealthy and sophisticated element that you see in you know, in the downtowns of major cities. So in terms of what individuals see in the course of their waking day, it was a very disaffected population.
Okay, so you have a cry of angst. You also have, as you say, a middle class less willing to acquiesce in American empire, and yet you still say in your book, despite these two forces that have converged together, and Trump is to a certain extent a manifestation of what happens when they collide, despite that, you still say in the book that America is fated to lead.
Yes.
So this question of global leadership, you know, where are we on that? And what happens
America
next?
is fated to lead with constraints. It's fated to lead because of what I said at the beginning. Its geographical situation combined with its river system gives it an ability to influence the world and have interests in the world. Because it came out of World War II far and away the strongest, it had a moral responsibility to lead. And what we've seen in the last 75 years is essentially American global leadership, specifically in Asia and in Europe. But I also said constraints. And I also write that the further away America gets from its frontier experience, from settling the West, the more mistakes it will make in foreign policy. The Iraq War, Vietnam were instances of not taking to heart the frontier experience. What was the frontier experience? It wasn't only about individualism. It was about communalism. It was about taking care of your own. It was about making sure you had supply lines. It was about thinking tragically in order to prevent tragedy. About thinking 4 or 5 steps ahead. That's the real full-bodied lesson of America's first experience in nation building, which was in the Trans-Mississippi or Rocky Mountain West.
So it's still fated to lead on the one hand, and it can't quite give up on that because of its power being so diffuse and being so invested in a system that America made, essentially. But on the flip side, you have this rebellion or critique of this version of American empire and power and the costs associated with it. So if I was to simplify that, you could say that there are 2 prevailing views in Washington in and around the White House, perhaps one that's more influential, which has been sometimes called the blob view of the national security establishment, that America cannot afford to give up on NATO, cannot afford to retreat from the parts of the world it's talking about retreating. And on the flip side, you've got in the Trump White House and in and around the Trump message, an alternative, much more radical critique of the blob, so-called. So which is in charge and where do we end up?
Let me answer with an anecdote from Somalia and from Bosnia, which is that if you declare and identify a human rights catastrophe somewhere to the American people, even Trump's people, they will feel compassionate, they will feel concerned. They're not bad people or heartless people. And that may get troops there to help the human rights problem. But the minute you start taking casualties, you better be able to articulate a naked national interest in a 15-second soundbite, or else the public will desert you in a second. And that's, that's the balance that you have to maintain. A humanitarian interest, which the blob loves, will get troops to a place, but it won't keep them there without a naked national interest, which is what the Trump people love.
Okay, but aren't we in a situation then, potentially, and if you take the Syrian airstrike as the first big act of Trump's foreign policy, you forget the things in and around the fringes, some of the messaging, some of the summits. If you take that versus the radicalism of the rhetoric coming out of some people associated with his campaign, particularly, most obviously, Steve Bannon, then isn't it in a situation where we are in the same place as we ever were with American foreign policy, that you have to have a sustainable national interest in these areas? There are impulses or ticks of humanitarian sentiment that America still wants to lead. It still wants to win when it competes with other powers. So actually, Trump is potentially not that radical a force in American foreign policy?
Yes, I think we're forgetting an element, though, John, which is the element of competence and foreign policy staffing, which is there are a lot of terrible things that happen around the world, and you're not going to be able to intervene and put things to rights because, for instance, if we toppled Bashar al-Assad tomorrow, Damascus may become a humanitarian hellhole just like Aleppo already is. Remember, Damascus is a city of almost the same size as Aleppo, 2.2 million. It's more or less at peace, though, with roadblocks and black market and violence around the edges, but no mass killing. That could change overnight if Assad were killed. So, but even if you don't have an argument for robust intervention, you've staffed out problems in advance. You have assistant secretaries, deputy assistant secretaries, undersecretaries who have an articulated policy response to things that could have been predicted in the first place. So even if you cannot intervene in a robust, satisfying way, there's all these other things you can do with your allies that may be able to contain the problem or show that you're involved in the problem, you're working towards a solution. But when you don't have people in the middle and upper middle levels of the bureaucracy, because nobody can get confirmed, because you can't find, nobody wants to serve with you, etc., every policy response becomes ad hoc and looks worse than it normally should. Syria, these are tough questions, and there is no easy answers. But what looks like a terrible response may be better if it was well staffed out.
Okay. Is it fair to say, and I have a follow-up question to this, is it fair to say, in lieu of a lot of appointments being made in the State Department, with questions over cuts to the State Department budget in particular, that the Pentagon has, perhaps unexpectedly, the extent to which it has, taken control of Trump's foreign policy? Or is there something else happening here?
This has been going on for about 25 years. It's been a gradual process of the Pentagon, overtaking the State Department. It's partially because in so many situations, actually carrying out a policy, involves some military action or other, even if it's nonviolent, simply because of the logistics or things. Remember, here's the problem. A policy that cuts the State Department by 30%, even after it's already undermanned, and wants to raise the Defense Department budget by 10%, is a policy that threatens American Caesarism. Where you put the military on a pedestal and combined with other actions, undemocratic-like actions, various forms of just decadence, a decadent image in the White House, putting the military on a pedestal. This is Caesarism, but there's another side to it, which is that it just turns out that the most competent, moderate, middle-of-the-road, responsible, analytically creative people in the Trump administration happen to be generals. Jim Mattis, the defense secretary, and H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor. It may not be healthy to have the military so front and center, but they're all we've got.
So, two questions on the back of that, because we've had General Mattis speak here before, we had H.R. McMaster speak here in January, just before he was appointed to the White House. And forgive me if I'm over-intellectualizing this,
right.
but I'll try it anyway. On the campaign trail, Trump spoke about the fact that America needed to start winning again, which is a vague concept if you break it down in foreign policy terms, but it spoke to something in a sense in which America had been beaten. On the flip side of that, the more intellectual side of that, you had at the Pentagon, articulated by General McMaster and General Mattis in other circumstances, a more sophisticated version of that, something called net assessment, whereby America focused on competition, thought more competitively again, rather than thinking in terms of a warm global glow of dominance. Is there something happening here whereby Trump saying America needs to start winning again, and the general saying, we've not had it our way, previous White Houses have been too controlled, we've had too much politicization of foreign policy. Is there kind of an emerging doctrine?
There may be. Remember, in saying we need to start winning again is essentially a reaction to the Iraq War, and not only to Iraq, but to the fact that Afghanistan is a place where the U.S. is not going to set that country to rights. And it can get out, but America just lacks the ability to set complex Islamic societies to rights in the correct direction. And since 2001, you've had the brunt of the casualties from Iraq and Afghanistan have come among the very class of people who are now falling through the cracks in the interior heartland. And so, it's a blunt, inarticulate phrase we have to start winning against, but it plays to the disappointments of Iraq and Afghanistan, I think, and also to the policy elite, which doesn't seem to learn, which wanted to go into Syria in a big way, and also, toppled a dictator in Libya who had given up his WMD, who is cooperating with American and other Western intelligence services, and who is as bad and oppressive as he was, had kept the country that was never really a country together.
Is there a tension here in how Americans are going to get on to specifics in the moment and test this winning again proposition? Is there a tension between how Americans view foreign policy on the one hand, and I don't want to generalize too much, but on the one hand a concern that the foreign policy establishment and the costs associated with it have become too large, the blob was too flabby, if you like, and that America was sort of obsessed about, overly adventurous. And you had Obama in that respect, retrenching or pulling away from a lot of these conflicts. And yet simultaneously you have a kind of a counter-reaction, which is America being perceived to be weak or not as effective or potent as powerful, doesn't actually play well at the base as well.
First of all, the foreign policy establishment in Washington and New York has been getting bigger and bigger since the 50s. And it's been getting bigger and bigger because of economic prosperity, which has funded corporations, which in turn funded think tanks, which in turn funded experts. And you've had the emergence of a policy class who all grew up wealthy, or many of them, in the suburbs. Many of them never served in the military. They didn't have the experience of witnessing or covering wars or anything like that. And their entire careers and their economic self-interest was tied up with America projecting power in a big way. And Trump is essentially saying these people have failed us. He didn't say look at Iraq and Afghanistan, but that's clearly what he meant, what Steve Bannon meant. And yet at the same time there's this, and Walter Russell Mead is the really originator of this concept of this Jacksonian impulse. And what is the Jacksonian impulse dumbed down? It's we don't believe, we're not in the business of promoting democracy around the world. That's not what we do. We're not going to set up little Americas around the world. We're not going to tell you to how to live your life, but don't tell us how to live our life. And if you humiliate us or you hurt us, we'll hunt you down and kill you. And and essentially, that's why Trump's advisors recommended to him to put the picture of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office, because I'm not convinced that Trump knows the history of Andrew Jackson. You know?
Alongside, let me add the Churchill bust, which was returned to its rightful place.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we get on to specifics then, we talked about the doctrinal background and the changing dynamics that underlay America's approach to the world. But you've had the airstrike in Syria, you had, maybe over symbolic, the mother of all bombs dropped upon an ISIS faction in Afghanistan, and you have saber rattling, or at least the testing of old style deterrence when it comes to North Korea. How are these things playing out in practice? And I'd ask you to speak first on North Korea.
Yes. First of all, don't think of North Korea as a communist regime. That's not helpful. It's helpful to think of it as a national fascist regime, very similar to Ceausescu's Romania in some respects. Its real hatred is directed against the Japanese more than it is against the South Koreans. Because remember, Japan occupied the Korean peninsula for 35 years, from 1910 to 1945, not just during World War II. And it was a very cruel occupation. And Kim Jong-un would find it easier to send a missile to Japan than against his ethnic compatriots in South Korea, I believe. Second thing is, all this is, Trump's saber rattling, in the waters around the Korean Peninsula is really directed at China. He's really saying, China, help me, do something about this. You're the ones who can influence North Korea. What makes the situation so dangerous is that it's unclear to me what China can actually do, because China has a long border with North Korea. The last thing it wants is a regime implosion that would lead to 2 million refugees crossing the Yalu River into Chinese Manchuria. It also doesn't want to see a regime implosion or transformation that ultimately leads to a greater Korea, democratically ruled from Seoul. That would be free market, democratic, with a border with China. Because China knows the history of divided country scenarios in the 20th century. East and West Germany, North and South Yemen, North and South Vietnam. Eventually, one half of the whole collapsed, and it was taken over by the stronger half, whether militarily stronger half or the economically stronger half. And in both cases, that's South Korea.
So as a follow-up question to that, when Mike Pence, the vice president, went to South Korea, he explicitly, actually interestingly, his father had served in Korea and with some distinction, but he explicitly linked what had happened in Afghanistan with the dropping of the Moab and the Syrian airstrike to the United States' seriousness, credibility, prestige, and willingness to project force against North Korea. What's your view of that? Are you concerned that perhaps there's a game of brinkmanship, or the crisis has been elevated too high?
I think he's trying to send different signals to North Korea than President Obama sent. President Obama sent a very unhelpful signal when he toppled Gaddafi, because Gaddafi had given up his WMD, and we helped topple him anyway. That sent a signal to North Korea: don't give up your WMDs, because that's the only thing that's protecting this regime in Pyongyang. What Pence is trying to say is, we bombed Syria, we dropped a big bomb in Afghanistan, the Obama administration is over. Don't base what you do based on what the Obama administration does. The bombing Syria and dropping the big bomb in Afghanistan may not have accomplished much at all, but they show that we've passed the point, that we're not intimidated. We relish the projection of power in the way that the Obama administration did not. So don't test us.
Okay, I'm going to link this back into a discussion on China in a moment, but I want to ask you whether in the sequence of events and the willingness to project American power, that the message was also perhaps directed at Tehran as well, and whether you think, I mean, when Walter Russell Mead spoke here the day after Trump was elected, that he thought that Iran was one area where the Trump administration was agreed upon, where there was concern about the nature of the deal. It's a deal that I know there's people here from the British Foreign Office, it's a deal that Britain feels quite invested in as well. So I wonder what you think the Trump administration's next steps might be vis-a-vis Iran.
That's a very fair analysis, John, that it was directed at Tehran as well. I think the most likely place where the U.S. and Iran could get into some sort of conflict is in Yemen. They can easily get into a proxy war there because neither side will be totally invested. Each can pull out, so it's a safe place to have a proxy war. The U.S. is concerned that the Yemeni port of Hodeidah, near at the mouth of the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, is if Iran consolidates its hold on that port, that would give it control or semi-control over a strategic choke point. Remember, China's building a military base in Djibouti on the other side of the Red Sea, very nearby. So this obviously worries planners like McMaster and Mattis. They don't want to see an Iranian puppet state in Yemen. And the Iranians also, have interests there as well. So it's the most likely place where both sides can get into a conflict without them actually shooting at each other. I can tell you, having reported from Yemen twice in the 80s and in the early 2000s, and having traveled all over the country, good luck. Yemen is almost an impossible to rule country. It's riven internally by vast mountain ranges. It was never really cohesive in ancient or modern history. It was always divided among tribes and clans. And even the central government for 30 years under Ali Abdullah Saleh, Ali Abdullah Saleh ran the country by making deals with the tribes, essentially. It was a very weak form of dictatorship.
Okay, I'm going to do a terrible thing and circle back again, away, pivot away from the Middle East, as others have done before, and take you back to China as the looming biggest grand strategic question for US foreign policy, and I wouldn't venture it too much to say it's actually the key question for global peace and security.
Yeah.
There are mixed messages in the Trump administration and how it's dealt with China right from the start. So there was a very evocative language during the campaign about China raping the United States in current economic relations, and yet Kissinger went with, I believe, with blessing to Beijing at one point. Rex Tillerson is someone who's known to have a potentially effective relationship with China. Even after the summit with President Xi and President Trump, Trump actually spoke about potential areas of cooperation. He sort of dialed down aspects of what he said. How do you see US-China relations developing over the next 4, potentially 8 years?
Okay, first of all, two observations. One, withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from TPP, which Trump did, was, in my mind, the greatest single self-inflicted wound America committed on itself in Asia for decades. Asia is about trade, it's about business, and it's about formality. And as Lee Long Sien, the Prime Minister of Singapore, said, withdrawing from TPP was like America leading its Asian allies up to the altar as the bridegroom, and then deserting the bride at the altar. Because remember, the pivot to Asia announced in the early Obama administration was never supposed to culminate in merely more destroyers and frigates and aircraft carriers in the South and East China Seas. It was supposed to culminate with a trade pact among American allies. And by withdrawing from that, basically what's happening is that these allies are now giving a second look at China's trade alliance. So that's one self-inflicted wound. The other thing is that China no matter what we say to China, no matter what the most brilliant policy analyst says to President Xi Jinping, he will not convince him to really change his policy in the South China Sea. And the reason for that is that China needs the South China Sea for the same reason that the Americans needed the Caribbean at the end of the 19th century. Think of the South China Sea as China's Caribbean, in the sense that the Caribbean got America's strategic dominance over the hemisphere, giving it power to spare to affect the other hemisphere. Dominance or parity with the American Navy in the South China Sea gives China the ability to, one, soften up Taiwan, because Taiwan is the cork in the bottle at the north end of the South China Sea. Two, gives its Navy wider access to the Pacific, but more important, allows its Navy and commercial fleet unfettered access through the Strait of Malacca. Think of that as a metaphor for the Panama Canal in the Caribbean. Unfettered access into the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean is the world's global energy interstate, across which the tankers travel, bringing oil and gas from the Middle East to all the middle-class great cities of East Asia. And with the Chinese Navy, and China's building or helping to finance ports throughout the Indian Ocean, with the Chinese Navy and fleet in both the Indian Ocean and the South and East China Sea, China becomes a great Eurasian military power for the first time. So the United States and China are locked into a disagreement over the South China Sea. However, as Henry Kissinger always tells his visitors, the American-Chinese relationship should never be condensed or distilled down merely to their disagreements in the South China Sea, because the US and China have so many other interests that have nothing to do with the South China Sea. It would be a tragedy if the relationship was distilled down to that.
Okay, I have about a million other questions, but I'm conscious of time. I want to bring in the audience for questions. So, the gentleman, the second row there.
Yes.
Get a microphone.
Hi there, Zach Pagan. Nice to see you again.
Yeah.
Couple of questions. Number one, it's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you again for the interview via Skype.
Yeah, we met over Skype, right?
Indeed, yes.
Yeah,
Thank you so much again for that.
Yeah.
So a couple of questions. One has to do with a comment you made on the TPP, and the other is completely unrelated and has to do with me satisfying interests in my own country, which is Canada. The first question is, do we think that the TPP, in fact, could have been a means of antagonizing China, and therefore pulling out of it could actually give China the breathing space it needs for a Sino-American relationship to proceed in a better direction? And I'm not sure also how we square the need geostrategically for the United States to proceed with the TPP with all of the things that you were saying about the devastated American heart of America, basically, by trade pacts over the past 30 years. That's question number one. Question number two is simply if you could speculate a little bit as to the advantages and limitations of Canada's geography and how they could potentially be overcome. Unrelated question, but my own interest.
Yeah, okay. I think China under Obama, at least until late Obama, when Obama himself started to walk away from TPP, China itself had factored in TPP as a foregone conclusion that they would have to live with. You know, they were ready to accept it. China was not going to go to war over TPP. And one thing about the South China Sea I forgot to mention, which is crucial, is China hopes to dominate it, but without ever firing a shot at the US Navy, because it knows it's at least a generation behind the US in naval warfare. So its South China Sea policy only works if it can avoid any actual military conflict with the US Navy. So China's not looking for a war, and it would have adjusted to TPP. It would have dealt with it. Not, you know, TPP being ripped apart is a gift to China, and in fact helped motivate Xi's speech at Davos, which never could have been given had Trump not been elected and withdraw, you know, and was preparing to withdraw from TPP. In terms of Canada, geopolitically, in terms of the constellation of population, Canada's population of 30 million or so is like Chile laid on its side. You know, everyone in Canada, more or less everyone, lives within 100 miles of the US border. So Canada is tied to the US economically. It's just, you know, it's a geographical circumstance of fact. But what countries do in this respect when they're a small part of an alliance is they often develop niche capacities. Whereby they become experts at certain things that the bigger country absolutely needs and requires, and that way gains leverage in a relationship. Like the Japanese have developed niche capacities in special operations forces in submarine warfare, just as the Swedes have developed a niche capacity in diesel submarine warfare. So that it's a matter of developing a niche capacity in something or a variety of things. I mean, Singapore is the ultimate niche capacity country. I mean, you know, in terms of what they provide the United States with just a few million people. So that's, you know, that's a way for Canada to magnify its power. Yeah.
Thank you very much. If I may take you back to your initial point about U.S. incursion into the Caribbean,
Yeah.
being the United States' first nation-building experience. Given the prominence, the importance of the frontier in American history, and the fact of American expansion across the Pacific, having later been seen as an extension of the frontier. How far might President Trump's more robust policy with regard to certain Asian powers, might there be the temptation for the Trump administration to use this as a nation-building experience above all of a divided country? I mean, one recalls that the USS Neversink in White Jacket did, after all, sail the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. And if I may try one more attempt, how far might greater emphasis on Asian policy be likely to bring about a continued slow and incremental American disengagement from European affairs without some complete or radical rupture?
Yes. First of all, America's nation-building experience in the Philippines, which came after that in the American West, was not a happy affair. You know, it went on actually until 1913, until the end of the Moro Rebellion in the southern Philippines. It was just as heartbreaking as the experience in Iraq or Afghanistan. North Korea, remember, there's the factor of China. We could never insert significant land forces there for nation building or anything without Chinese approval and without the Chinese probably taking part.
I meant in order to try and bring America, the divided American society, back together.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Yeah, I misunderstood your question. Look, clearly, if there was a conflict, a shooting conflict, if China were to get into a shooting conflict with Japan over the East China Sea, or North Korea were to fire at South Korea or Japan, South Korea and Japan are first-level treaty allies of the United States, and any American president would probably unite the country behind him in a conflict, you know, in a conflict like that. So that's a very, you know, with all of the lack of competence in the Trump administration, that I could go on for a long time, you know, positions unfilled and the ones filled often with second or third-rate characters. If there was an actual shooting war, the country might very likely, at least in the early stages, unite behind the president. That's the default emotion of the American people, at least in the early stages of a conflict. And your second question was?
The consequences of greater, of continued of continued American engagement in and commitment to
with Asia,
for U.S. policy in Europe?
Yeah, again, this is something that's been going on for years now and has a lot of dimensions to it. For instance, in the 90s, when the Clinton administration was so focused on Bosnia, Kosovo, on Europe, many of the assistant secretaries in the State Department, in the Defense Department, were people of European extraction, of European descent, whose parents or grandparents had been in World War II, in some cases were Holocaust refugees, etc. Nowadays, if you look at the American bureaucracy, the middle and upper middle levels, you see more and more people of Indian descent, of Asian descent, of Latin American descent. You know, it's a result of the immigration that poured into America in the 1970s and 80s that has now changed the nature of the policy elite in the various departments, so that there's simply not this emotional, you know, impossible to quantify focus on Europe that there was before. Also, to the degree that the world economy has a geographical organizing principle or fulcrum, it's Asia, and increasingly Asia. The Pentagon, for instance, what does a building of 22,000 civil servants do? It plans for a war. You know, that's what it does. It plans. And what are most of the plans oriented on? China. Much less so than on Russia. Russia #2, but China #1. But even if there's never a war with China, the very fact of planning it, planning for one puts an emphasis on Asia as opposed to one on Europe.
Okay. Third row there. We'll take 2 questions actually. Does a lady have her hand up there?
Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. Can I try and link, please, your road trip and your book with Trump's election?
Yeah.
Because I'm struck that what you reported wasn't seen by the Republican Party in 2 consecutive elections and still isn't seen by the Democratic Party today. Was Trump just lucky, or did he do something very clever? And what's the lesson for others in terms of the characteristics that you identified in America and the notion that there may be similar in other countries?
Yes. Trump is not an articulate man, but he's been successful enough in business to the point where you have to assume that he has some instinctive, impossible to articulate knowledge about the world and how things work. And I think he looked at this and said, this is an arbitrage opportunity in a way. The Republican Party is talking about we need to be engaged, we need to intervene in Syria, we need to do all this. And he's saying, haven't they read the headlines of the past 15 years in Iraq and Afghanistan? Whereas a large part of the American people have actually suffered from those wars. I mean, you know, you had, it's not the 7,000 or 8,000 killed in both wars. It's like the 40,000 who were severely injured to the point of having life-changing injuries that affect families. You know, it radiates outwards into children, you know, wives, grandchildren, etc. And I think Trump tapped into this because if you looked at the primaries, all the Republican candidates were acting as if the disappointments of Iraq and Afghanistan hadn't happened, and as if the stagnation of American wages in the interior heartland hadn't happened either. And Trump just saw a wide opening, so to speak. And I think you see this around the world. I think we saw quite a bit of this in Britain with the Brexit vote. I mean, London is just booming. You know, it's real estate expensive, Euro England. And there are other parts of the country which are like the interior America. Orban in Hungary is very much a Trump-like figure in this respect. I think, you know, if you look at Marine Le Pen in France, even if she loses in 2 weeks, she will probably still get a very healthy number of voters, which will change French politics significantly. So that I think the populist upheaval that we've seen in the West is because globalization, while creating an upper middle class cosmopolitan global elite and unifying these elites across from, horizontally from one country to the other, has opened up fissures vertically down deep in individual countries themselves. So that globalization has divided America. And you see this in the interior of America. The part of America that has benefited from it and whose lives have been enriched from it, not just economically, but culturally, aesthetically, in many other ways. And the other part that hasn't been, that just hasn't benefited because they cannot compete. They don't have quite the brilliance. They're not articulate enough. But for one reason or another, they cannot compete and they're resentful.
Thank you. Yes, lady. Back.
Does China have an advantage over parliamentary democracies like the US or the UK in terms of being able to set and deliver long-term policy in a way that we don't so much, because there are changes of parties and governments over time, and that will have an impact on what they're really able to deliver and design on issues to do with the South China Sea or trade deals?
Yeah, that's always been a challenge for democracies. There was a great American naval strategist, Alfred Thayer Mahan, about 120 years ago, who said democracies are particularly bad at planning for the future. And particularly bad at planning for bad outcomes or bad things that might happen, because they always have to satisfy people at the next election. Where an authoritarian system, precisely because there's no peaceful way to remove a leader often, can plan for the long term. So China does have a built-in advantage in that sense. But I would say the disadvantage in China, in terms of China, is that because communism is philosophically dead in China, the only legitimacy that the rulers of China have is the ability to make people's lives economically better, more or less, every few years. And here's the rub. Even if they succeed, you pass through an invisible point where you make people prosperous enough and then money's not enough for them. They want freedom. China has many internal stresses that will really challenge its authoritarian leaders, particularly if the economy keeps growing, albeit at a slower rate than it has been growing. So that yes, authoritarian systems are more predictable, they're more dependable, they can plan for the future, they don't zigzag with policy the way the way democratic systems do, but they also have built-in structural faults as well.
Okay, two gentlemen in the front row. If we take those questions together, then we might have to wrap it up.
Sorry, David Shipley from Spitfire Capital. Mr. Kaplan, thanks very much for a really interesting set of answers. Returning to the subject of China and American potential future conflict, as I understand it, the US is much more dependent on sort of space-based systems for command and control, whereas China, being a more regional power, is much more dependent on sort of long and mid-range radars. To what extent do you think that would impact the planning that each nation might undertake for a potential conflict, and does that difference make a conflict more or less likely?
Yeah, first of all, Nate...
Just take the other question.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Sorry, kind of connected. So if you looked now, with hindsight, sort of 100 years ago, 150 years ago, you'd probably say it was an inevitability, or quite possibly say it was an inevitability, that America would take over from Britain as a global power. But with that, because of America's roots, didn't come a great change in global orthodoxy, and legal or moral or otherwise. Do you see it now as an inevitability that China will take over from America as the global superpower, and with that potentially a significant change in global sort of moral legal orthodoxy? And if you do, would you advocate, though it may seem immoral, a sort of American foreign policy which potentially foments domestic or regional unrest around China? Is that something which would be sensible, bad though it seems?
Yeah. First of all, naval warfare is increasingly not in the water. It's increasingly space-based, air-based. You know, this started when the first plane took off from an aircraft carrier. It stopped being a navy and started to be naval forces, you know, naval, air, cyber, space, ballistic missiles, any future naval conflict. And we haven't really seen you know, a direct high-end naval battle since the Battle of the Philippine Sea in World War II. Maybe the Falklands War was one exception. But in the future, naval battles will involve more missiles. They will feature and that's the real development in naval warfare. It's the development in missile technology, which is driving navies underwater. It's why submarines have become the platform of choice. And there's actually a debate, a very feisty debate in the American defense establishment about whether we should build more aircraft carriers. You know, because surface ships become more and more vulnerable to missile technology that's developing at a faster pace. So it's not just space-based. It's, you know, it's very complex. It's about the integration of systems, you know, and computers, so that, you know, if we were to have a naval conflict, you know, with anyone, with China, don't assume it would be short and sharp and easily contained. It could get easily out of hand, because here's the problem, and then I'll get to the next question. The problem is that China and Russia, and, you know, we could talk about a Black Sea naval conflict, a Baltic Sea conflict. China and Russia are not democratic states, which means that if an American president is humiliated in war, he's still the president. His approval ratings may go down. He may not get reelected, or he may choose not to run for reelection, or, you know, like Lyndon Johnson. But the system still holds. But if an authoritarian leader is ultimately humiliated in a few days of high-intensity naval conflict, the system may not hold. And then the world would not be the same afterwards, because the stability of China and Russia are what are the organizing principles for Eurasia in general. On China, I don't think it's inevitable that U.S. power will ultimately pass to China. I think that China has a lot of internal stresses. We haven't even mentioned the ethnic conflicts with the Uyghurs, the Inner Mongolians, the Tibetans. I would much rather have America's internal problems than to have China's problems. And again, the more successful the regime in Beijing gets, the harder it gets to satisfy people and actually govern. So that I think the real issue in the future is not America in a linear pattern handing over the baton to China the way Britain handed over the baton to America. It's that all great powers today are declining in absolute terms. American power, in many ways, is declining in absolute terms. You know, China is not growing as much as we think maybe, and Russia is an economic basket case. So you say, well, if all these, but they're declining at different speeds. And America is doing well precisely because it has less internal stresses than China or Russia. But if they're all declining, or at least not growing in some respect, what's the world then? It's what I call the age of comparative anarchy. When great powers play less and less of a role, even if it's just 10% less of a role, and you have a whole stream of other powers, there's less of someone to provide the engine for global order.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up with one final question, given that we've, and I want to thank you before I ask that question, given that we've arranged over such a broad global scope, and also up and down vertically through the global elite through to the squeeze middle classes, or whatever they're called in Britain and the United States. And it's a final question. It's one we have not touched upon, but I think relates most directly to British national security concerns, which would be Russia.
Yeah.
How worried should, first, the West be about Russia, and second, more explicitly, I think would be relevant to many people in this audience, how worried should the UK be about Russia?
I think very worried. Russia is the more near-term threat, even if China is the bigger, more distant threat. Russia is, look, there aren't hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in the heart of Germany like there was during the Cold War. There may be 80, 90,000 Russian troops to the east of the Baltic states in the Kola Peninsula. So that's less of an overt formal threat, conventional threat. But in an age of cyber, what Russia is doing now is it's practicing traditional soft imperialism, meaning it's through subversion. Throughout Central and Eastern Europe and Scandinavia, it's running organized crime groups. It's buying off corrupt politicians. It's running cyber attacks. It's buying media through third parties. It's corrupting regimes from Estonia in the north to Bulgaria in the south. So it's a very insidious form of a threat. And the Russians are also brazen in a way that the Chinese are not. The Chinese are so careful. They proceed in the South China Sea with micro steps. So as any reaction you have to what they do seems like an overreaction. Whereas the Russians are more brazen with overflight rights, etc. The Russians are quite prominent in the city of London. I've heard. It's said that Montenegro, which may get into NATO very soon, is essentially been bought by Russian oligarchs, essentially. So that Russia's a real threat. It's a real danger. And these overflights, these planes flying back and forth, along the borders of the Baltic Sea, the Ukraine, this could get out of hand. And if there is a conflict, Britain is the most reliable ally of the United States within NATO.
I'm not sure if that's good news or bad news to finish on. Just to say, ladies and gentlemen, we have an event in here shortly afterwards, so unfortunately we're going to have to shoo you out relatively quickly. But I'd just like to thank you all for coming and for your questions.
Thank you, John.
And to thank
Thanks,
Bob
everyone.
in particular.
Yeah.